Oregon fans, what is going on? What's up, everybody? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. Just in case you're new here, I'm your host, Max Torres, talking with my guy, Spencer McLaughlin, the host of the Locked On Ducks and Locked On Pac-12 podcast. Got his hand in a little bit of everything, but I talked to Spencer after our last show, and I just said, you know what? Like, we should just make this a weekly thing. We're still kind of trying to figure out the schedules, but, I go on his show, he comes on my show. Really like the chemistry and just love the common conversations that we have. So with all that being said, Spencer, thanks for being here, man. How are we doing on this fine Tuesday?
It's my pleasure as always to be back with you, Max, and I'm totally with you. Just doing shows like this. I know we get a lot of positive feedback. I get the same sort of comments on my channel on YouTube, like, "Oh man, love having Max, love you and Max." And one thing that we have to do. I don't know specifically when. Feels like maybe a big game sort of thing. But I've had a couple people say, "Hey, Spencer, you should do a show with Max and Ryan Winter." And
I've
have
seen
the
that
have
too.
the three of you on at once. I think one day we got to give the people what they want for that. That might be a little, might be a little bit too much of me, but that's why you two would be there perhaps. But no, it's great to be on with you as always.
Yeah, man. Well, it's gonna be a fun one that we have in store. Obviously, it's UCLA week for Oregon, so kind of what we're gonna dive into here is setting the stage for Oregon against UCLA. As you guys know, I'm trying to ramp up the podcast and do a couple more, just do more frequent shows. And this one's a cool opportunity to do it early in the week, kind of tackle some broad storylines, take an early look at this matchup for Oregon and UCLA. So both teams coming off buys, which is an interesting deal. Game day is going to be in town. We got number 9 UCLA versus number 10 Oregon. So there's plenty that we can get into. But before, just off the top, we wanted to hit on a question that we got in the comments. But before we do that, just if you guys are here in the live show, throw a question in the live chat. We're at youtube.com/Oregon Football Max Torres. That's where you can always find us in pretty much every show. But yeah, I know that Spencer, you were excited to tackle this question. So let's put it up here. Raymond says, Max Torres and Spencer McLaughlin, why is Oregon favored over UCLA? How about you take this one, and then I'll kind of piggyback off it and give some of my thoughts too.
Yeah, I love the use of full names there. You don't see that very often. That's how you that's how you stand out. I also love the Torres troops and Spencer soldiers comment over there by Brooks. That's awesome. Awesome stuff. So the short answer here is because this game is in Autzen Stadium. Oregon's won 23 straight at home. They haven't lost since 2018. Now, the quality opponents they've had come through have probably not always been in UCLA's class. And I think at the time BYU was playing like a team that was at that sort of level, and Oregon dispensed of them. And since then, BYU has not necessarily been bad, but they haven't been great. And look, I'm skeptical about Oregon getting into the college football playoff this year. A lot of things would have to go right, and you have to win a lot of really big games. Thankfully, they're at home, but as the season goes on, if we get into that situation and we're looking at quality non-conference wins, the Georgia game, of course, stands out in a bad way. The BYU game is looking on a week-by-week basis like it's not going to hold up the way we hoped it would when it took place at the time. It's still a good, solid win, especially since it was 41-7 through 3 quarters. But that's the sort of performance that I think has the bettors putting this number right around Oregon -6. And I am liking the Ducks in this game because they're at home. And so I think the reason they're favored against UCLA, right, rankings for the AP poll and power rankings are two very different things. And I think they should be separate categories because
Sure.
an AP ranking is something you have earned in the eyes of the voters, either this season or the season prior. And I do believe in this sport. It's unique and fun and good for the sport to be able to reward teams for what they have done. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to hold up over the course of the rest of the season. For example, right, when you look at betting numbers, great example is last weekend. Oklahoma hosted Kansas. Oklahoma had been a disaster. Kansas had been the best story in college football. And the line opened at Oklahoma -8. It closed at Oklahoma -10.5, and they won by 10 because Vegas is just absolutely undefeated. But the point stands that UCLA should be ranked ahead of Oregon, not just because they have no losses, but because they have more impressive wins. They have the most impressive win in Utah, but they're very close despite Oregon having a loss and UCLA having none. And Oregon is favored in this game because when you look at the opponents they've played and how those results have manifested, UCLA's resume is pretty impressive with that win against Utah. They also handled Washington very well. And Oregon's has, got some solid wins, but they're really playing the tough part of their schedule in the second half of this season. But still, they've looked impressive against the teams that they should, and they're playing at home. That's the biggest factor here, is that this is in Eugene at Autzen Stadium. That's why they're favored.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Oregon, you could argue, and maybe it wouldn't even be that much of an argument, they have the best home field advantage in the conference. I mean, you could probably put Utah up there in that conversation.
Utah's got to be up there too, but I mean, 23 in a row speaks for itself.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it starts with that, but obviously it's much deeper than just where the game is being played. For me, Spencer, when I look at UCLA, up until those wins over UW and Utah, I was like, these guys are undefeated, but they haven't played anybody. They haven't played good teams, and a couple of those wins were scary close. But now, clearly, it looks like something has, a switch has flipped a little bit in Westwood, and they have two really quality wins over Washington and Utah. Both of those wins, I believe, those are the first Pac-12 losses for both teams, but obviously Utah had already lost at Florida. But for me, I think that Oregon has won its games more convincingly, and I think that they've also been very well tested so far in this season. They haven't had too many super easy games. You have Stanford, obviously that Stanford's a train wreck, but they were able to beat Notre Dame. So what does that say about Notre Dame?
That Notre Dame is even worse. That's a bad football team.
It's not good over there. But I think another reason that I would say Oregon is favored here is partially due to the familiarity. I think we saw how last year's game played out. And granted, it's not the same team, and that's not the point I'm trying to make. But I think Oregon, for me, they have a good idea of how to attack this game plan, seeing that there are a lot of the similar faces from last year, especially DTR and Zach Charbonnet. But now you got a plan for Jake Bobo, who's a really, really talented wide receiver coming over from Duke. He's really put on a show. So I think that I have some confidence here for Oregon, especially because they look like a much better overall team than last year. Granted, I think that the defense obviously still has some room to grow, and the offense isn't perfect either. But I think you have so much confidence in this offense now compared to this point last year that you have the confidence for them to be able to show up in a big time game. And even though the defense isn't amazing, they continue to prove that they can stop the run. That battle in the trenches is going to be really a huge one to watch. And I think with each week, we're seeing them kind of step up to the plate and make some big plays when the team really needs it most.
Yeah, and one thing that Oregon fans need to keep in mind when playing UCLA and looking at the schedules and the teams they've played, I too was off-put by that game against South Alabama where they needed a last-second field goal to win, and they were at home. Now, granted, they don't have a great home field advantage, and South Alabama
What, you mean no one wants to go to UCLA games? Come on, that can't be the case.
Unfortunately for the Bruins, it is the case. They should just build a 40,000 seat stadium right on campus, but they're not going to do that because they don't care about football that much. But right now, plenty of fans care because they're quite good. And one thing to note, when people look at South Alabama and, just hear it's a directional school down south, that's not Louisiana State, right? That's going to put in their minds a vision of, well, they're overrated. They're this, they're that. South Alabama plays in the Sun Belt, or as we know it as college football fans this year, the Fun Belt. They're also 5-1 right now. And don't be surprised if they're a double-digit win team when the season comes to a close. Should UCLA still win that game by more than a last-second field goal? Yes. But don't look at that outcome and say, no, UCLA is not actually that good if they're capable of that, because Washington is pretty good. Washington is a 5-2 team. And if Michael Penix doesn't throw the ball off the back of his lineman's helmet on accident and have it pop up in the air for a pick six, there's a really good chance Washington is 6-1 and still in the top 25. Then how do you feel about UCLA after they are up 40-16 going into the fourth? The Utah game, though, is indicative, I think, of what UCLA is capable of. And that's winning the Pac-12. They absolutely could. They're in a position to do so, but they have the team to do so. Some teams get to that sort of spot and then they flame out as the year goes on. I think Oregon was like that a season ago. They peaked earlier in the year against Ohio State, and then it kind of went down, 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 got to Utah, and it just wasn't even close. And the team wasn't capable of accomplishing that, even though the record would have indicated they could. UCLA is a team that escaped against South Alabama, but now they're confident and rolling. And since they've gotten into conference play where they're 3-0, they have played really good football. And that game against Utah cannot be underestimated because Utah, I still contend, is a really good football team. They can still win the Pac-12, not just with their record, but because, as I was talking about a moment ago, they're good enough to do so. They still have that team. And UCLA was up 17 late in that game. That cannot be overlooked. This is a good Bruins team. They do a lot of things well, and they have improved upon their weaknesses that held them back from being a 9 or 10 win team a season ago. They could have been last year because they had really good weapons. They had DTR, and I think their offensive line was a touch better last year, though it's still pretty good. They needed to fix a few things defensively, and they have with a new defensive coordinator. They've at least made improvements, and that's exactly what they needed.
Yeah, so this UCLA team, I watched that Utah game, and that was a heck of a game. Cameron Rising really did everything he could to get Utah back into that game, but UCLA looks like they're a super solid team, and they're picking up kind of where they left off a little bit last year, and then some. Really looking like they're picking up some solid steam, and they've played some really quality opponents, like you were mentioning, in Pac-12 play so far. We want to talk about the Pac-12 picture in a little bit here because that's obviously something huge going into this game. But we got to talk about game day, man. College game day, heading back to Eugene for the first time since 2018. Was I at the game the last time college game day was there? Yes, I was. And I watched the fumbles and the heartbreak and just all the air gets sucked
Bad
out
vibes.
of Autzen. Very bad vibes.
Bad vibes.
Also got LaMichael James's autograph, so that was a highlight from that game.
That is a major upside for what was otherwise a horrific day.
Yeah, it was tough. It was tough, man. But you got to keep going. And this is it's awesome for Oregon to be on the big stage like this. It's big for the West Coast, big for the Pac-12. Who even knows how many more times we're going to see this matchup with UCLA going out to Big Ten country. So I think that's something that kind of factors into this game. Another chance for Oregon, perhaps one of their last chances to get a marquee win over UCLA. But we got game day in town, so everyone's going to be there. 12:30 kickoff on Fox. So it's gonna be a fun one, and it's another opportunity for Oregon to step up to the plate, show that they can show up in these big time games. It comes at home, which is great. You're rested up off of the bye, which is also good. I know we were talking about that last week when I had you on. And the nice thing I think for Oregon here, don't want to go into too much of a tangent, Spencer, but UCLA is also coming off their bye. I feel like that's not something that happens super often in college football. So in the same sense that Oregon is trying to harness that momentum from the Arizona game, UCLA is also tasked with the similar challenge, trying to make sure they don't, get too complacent with that win over Utah. So there's a lot going into this game, and I just can't wait.
Yeah, there are a lot of big picture storylines here, and the Pac-12 is complicated at the moment. Now, there will be less complicating factors after this game has a result that's not a tie, which we don't have ties in college football because unlike the NFL, we know that the point of playing is to win the game or lose the game. That's the entire point. I hate that the NFL introduced ties. It's just like, leave that to the Europeans and their soccer, man. This is America. This is football. We play to win or we play to lose. There's none of this tying absolute nonsense. But you mentioned UCLA and Oregon and how many more times we'll see this. They're not scheduled to play in the conference slate next year. You never know if they could meet potentially in the Pac-12 championship game. But I wonder if when UCLA goes to the Big Ten, if Oregon and UCLA will ever reach out, if let's assume and it's certainly not a given, Oregon stays in the Pac-12 or Pac-10, whatever becomes of it. I wonder if Oregon and UCLA would reach out to one another. And frankly, is this a
I'd be down.
G-rated? Is this a G-rated show, Max? So
Yeah, I try to keep it
okay,
clean.
yeah. So if college football scheduling didn't collectively have its heads up its rear ends,
there we go.
You could actually put together some really fun matchups down the line, because I think generally speaking, people remember Oregon think outside the West Coast. You want to get attention on your program, or you want to get attention on just the West Coast in general. If you're George Kliavkoff, the commissioner, you have to go to the brands and names that people know. And people outside of the West Coast, I talked to all sorts of people at the Locked On Network about Oregon and what they say, and that sort of thing. Here's what they know: they know USC, they know Oregon because of flashy uniforms, and specifically, they know Chip Kelly. And so if they hear Oregon Chip Kelly, I think if UCLA continues to be a good team, it's a matchup down the line that's still going to have that appeal. Is it the same as his initial return in 2018? No. But what's most exciting about this one is this is Chip's best team. This UCLA team would trounce the 2018 Bruins team, and they would beat comfortably the 2020 Bruins team. This is a really good football team. And if UCLA continues to be strong even after DTR leaves, which will be the Bruins' biggest question going forward into their final year in the Pac-12 and then into the Big Ten, I think that appeal is still there. But college football scheduling is ridiculous, and they schedule these non-conference foes 15, 75 years in advance. I don't even know. It's so absurd. Like, why do I know what Oregon's non-conference opponent is for the next 3 or 4 years? Next year, it's going to be Texas Tech. Well, that could be a good game, but it could also be a game that doesn't do Oregon any favors. Because if you go beat Texas Tech and they turn out to be a 5-7, 6-6 team, which they're capable of being, like, what advantage do you have? Whereas if you left these options open, this is like my biggest gripe with college football, which I enjoy more than the NFL, though I watch the professional ranks quite a bit, and I pull my hair out over fantasy football all the time, right? Like I'm not
I'm horrible.
anti-NFL.
All my teams suck. I hate it. I can't
Dude,
deal with it.
I lost by 5 points this week, and Saquon Barkley kneeled at the 1 yard line instead of going into the end zone for what would have been the matchup winning touchdown. But it's okay. I'm over it now. And so I'm not. But that's the sort of thing that going forward, I think college football's got to be able to fix. Like, you could set up all these sorts of matchups. Oregon USC is still a big game. Fox, ESPN, CBS. I mean, CBS doesn't have a contract on the West Coast and whatnot, but I think CBS is part of the Big Ten deal. I'd have to go back and look at that. That might be wrong. But so if you're looking at setting up non-conference matchups, former Pac-12 foes, Oregon with either LA school, Oregon USC,
They'll eat it up, man.
yeah, they'll eat it up. But because we decide to pick our non-conference opponents 8 to 10 years in advance, we can't do that. But I think it's what makes so much of this matchup intriguing is not just that it could be the last time that they play for God only knows how long. Heck, maybe ever. Probably not. They'd likely meet if you gave it 50 years at some point. But just the fact that UCLA is now going to get their best shot to knock out Oregon with Chip Kelly in the Pac-12. That's what's on the line here. And the winner is more than in the driver's seat to get to the Pac-12 championship game. Like, the winner controls their own fate and could even lose a game after this and still be in good shape. But if you lose this game, you then don't have a head-to-head, and the tiebreakers, which I talked about on Locked On Pac-12, are wildly confusing, and it is an absolute mess. And let's leave it at that. So it puts a team in a really, really advantageous situation given the schedules they've got going forward.
All right. Well, yeah, good ending point there. We're going to go ahead and take a quick break. And then on the other side, Spencer and I are going to dig into the Pac-12 picture, as well as some of the recruits heading to Eugene and some possible impact a win could have for the Ducks on the recruiting trail. Don't go anywhere. We got more Oregon football talk for you after this. All right, welcome back to the Ducks Dish podcast. I'm your host, Max Torres, talking with Locked On Ducks host Spencer McLaughlin ahead of Oregon's big matchup against the UCLA Bruins on Saturday. The last two undefeated conference teams in the Pac-12 So what we're going to get into now is what we alluded to a little bit before the break. We're going to assess the Pac-12 picture, which is kind of a mess just because of the new structure of the. It's a major mess. It's a major mess. Maybe I put it too lightly, but it's a mess because we have the new format where conferences don't matter as much, or divisions rather don't matter as much. And I mean, the top of the Pac-12, like I never. Not never, but I did not think that we would be in the situation we are now where the Pac-12 is kind of a top-heavy team where, the top 4 teams are real solid and the bottom of the conference is just atrocious. I'm talking to you, Colorado and Stanford and Cal. Shout out to Colorado getting their first win.
Yes, shout out to the Buffs.
But we got to talk
to the Buffs.
I'm getting some heinous comments here, so I'm going to try to block the user. Sorry about those. There's not even that many people here. It's like, there's like 20 or so people here, but usually if it's bigger. But yeah, so let's recircle. If Oregon can win this game, obviously that would be huge for them to pick up a win over what looks like the top team in the conference right now. And it would just bode well, I think, for the rest of the season. But you still have some real tough games with Washington and Utah both coming to town. So even if you get past this game, you're still not really a shoo-in, but man, it would be huge for them.
Yeah, so something I've talked about on my channel that's really interesting is Oregon's schedule. And their schedule, for the most part, is pretty favorable because they have all their toughest games remaining at home. But when you look at it in the context of winning the Pac-12 and the schedules that the other teams have, most of them, basically all of them, have already played most of their toughest games. Oregon still has to play them. So, for example, USC has 2 games feasibly where they could lose, and one of them they're not going to in Notre Dame. I say feasibly they could lose that game because big brands, big game, you never know, right? But Notre Dame is pretty darn bad. So really UCLA or USC after last week rather, against Utah, which they've gotten out of the way, has 1 losable game left. Now they don't have as much margin for error, but that game is UCLA. Bruins, same situation. They're going to be big favorites in every game they play, except that game against USC. Look at Utah. They could very easily win out if they're able to beat Oregon because they don't have anybody that's really tough remaining on their schedule. They've got Colorado. They've got Arizona. Their toughest game after a bye this week is Washington State. And the Cougars' offense is not where it needs to be to keep up with the Utes, even if their defense keeps Cam Rising and company in check. They're not going to be able, I don't think, to just score enough points. They're not moving the football. They can't run it, and they're too reliant on Cam Ward. So if Utah gets by Washington State, they've just got Oregon. But Oregon's got UCLA. They're the only team that's got 4 games I could see them losing, and it wouldn't be a major upset per se. Everybody else has no more than 2, and some only have 1. UCLA would not be a major upset, right? Because it's less than a touch. Anything that's under a touchdown or frankly under 10 points is not like a major upset, depending on where the game is being played. Utah certainly would not be a major upset. Washington, I expect Oregon to be able to win that game because I think the Huskies are a year or 2 away from being really, really good. But would I be shocked if they push the Ducks and then they make a mistake late and lose? I could see it happening. It's not the least conceivable thing in the world, right? A major upset for Oregon would be Cal and Colorado, right? Either of those games being lost. I mean, those are bad football teams. I'm happy for the Buffs. I really am that they didn't have to watch their team go 0-12, but they might be going 1-11, which is what I had them at before the season. And Cal is not very good. Cal still cannot score. Their defense is just okay. And then Oregon State, I don't know if you've watched them play at Reser Stadium, Max, but they're a tough team to beat down there in Corvallis. And it's not a long road trip for the Ducks, but there's going to be a lot of Beaver fans there on a percentage basis, and they'll be as loud as they possibly can because even though they've got minimum capacity, they are very, very loud, and they play exceptionally well at home. Like you can't every team is better at home than they are on the road, but look at Oregon State. They should have lost to Stanford. They didn't. They came back and made a play late in the game, but they should have lost to Stanford on the road, and they controlled the game for the most part against Washington State at home. Those are 2 radically different performances, and the Beavs have a nasty secondary. Their defense is much better overall than you'd think. And if Chance Nolan can get back healthy, they've got some nice offensive pieces and they know how to run the football. So I think that those are like when you look at the body of work remaining for the Ducks, it's easily, I mean, easily the toughest of what you have for the compared to the other Pac-12 contenders, which is what makes each of these games so much more critically important for the Ducks.
All right. I see your point. We're talking about kind of remaining schedule, obviously for Oregon, and then some of those other top schools in the Pac-12 from a standing standpoint. That sounded kind of weird coming
They've
out.
just got a lot of Arizonas and Stanfords and Colorados and Cal's teams that Oregon will play Colorado and Cal, but they've already played Arizona and Stanford, which were comfortable wins. They've gotten those out of the way, but have more tough games remaining. Whereas UCLA has already played Washington. UCLA does not play Oregon State, or USC has already played Oregon State, right? Just those games, USC has already played Washington State, who's a solid team that could probably beat anybody in the conference if they're playing their best. So I just think that is an interesting caveat, that at the same time it's advantageous, but also compared to the other teams, I think Oregon's in the toughest spot.
Yeah, and I see what you mean. I think it is fortunate for Oregon that a lot of their toughest games are at home.
Yes.
Obviously, that's going to be a big advantage. And then I think I have some confidence against Oregon State because even though they've been playing good football, this Oregon team looks like they can take care of business on the road at least a little bit more effectively than previous Oregon teams. But I do want to get to some recruiting stuff, but wanted to give you a chance if you had any more that you wanted to add on the Pac-12 picture, because it's looking like if Oregon can take care of its business, they could, they could, and they probably should, be able to get to that Pac-12 championship game, in my opinion. But maybe the college football playoff is another discussion that we need to have for a future date.
Yeah, I think a Pac-12 championship game, at least appearance coming into this year, was my expectation, and it's well within reach.
Sure.
Right? You escaped against Washington State, so the conference record is unblemished a third of the way through. I don't expect them to go 9-0. Nobody's done that before, and I don't think there's a team in the Pac-12 that can do that this year, including Oregon. But I think they're in a really good position. And after a horrible start to the year, they've set themselves up to still accomplish a lot and have a very successful season.
Absolutely. All right. So wanted to talk a little bit of recruiting. You doing all right on time?
Yep. Yeah. Good.
All right, sweet. So Oregon is going to be hosting a pretty significant slew of recruits, kind of like using that word, on campus in Eugene for some visits this weekend. Dan Lanning was talking about this during the bye week, how there's a lot of talented recruits coming to campus. I do have a story over on ducksdigest.com just compiling some of the early names, but it's only Tuesday, so we're going to be getting more and more. But some of the biggest ones right now that are at least scheduled to be in attendance, looking in the 23 class, you have defensive line commit Tavita Pomee from Utah, safety commit Cody DeCambra out of Bishop Gorman in Las Vegas. And then right now, the bulk of the other recruits that are heading to Eugene are coming from Modern Day, which is just, the number one team in the country. I've seen them play 3 times this year, and they are insane. Just so much talent from top to bottom. And what's really interesting with them is that they're not a senior heavy class, Spencer. It's a lot of 2024s, a lot of 2025s. And most of these guys that are coming have Oregon offers. Brandon Baker, the younger brother of Gary Baker, the former Oregon defensive lineman, he's going to be here, and he's going to be in Eugene. DeAndre Carter, another offensive lineman from Modern Day. You have wide receiver Jack Ressler from Modern Day, running back Nate Frazier, who recently picked up an offer. I talked to him after the St. John Bosco game, and he is loving Oregon. And I know that the Oregon staff is super, super high on him. And then you have the other piece in the backfield for Modern Day, 2025 5-star running back Jordan Davison, who is just looks like a man amongst boys out there. He's only a true sophomore, and he looks like he's huge. He's like 5'10", 5'11", and like 215. He's just massive. People bounce off of him. And then you also have 2025 athlete LaMason Waller, who just backed off his commitment from Washington. So we're still looking at trying to compile some more names. I'm going to update that list as we get more into it. But this is like the game that recruits want to be at. They want to see what the game day environment is like in Eugene, and they want to see what the game day environment is like when you have the sports signature show on campus. Students are back, obviously. School has been in session for a while. You know the atmosphere is going to be insane. So if Oregon can show up and just put on a show, I mean, if Oregon can blow out UCLA, I'm not saying that's likely, but if they can get a win here, like that would just be huge, because I think when we're talking recruiting, I don't really feel like we really saw that recruiting domino effect from the Dante Moore commitment. I feel like it was, weeks to go by and I'm like, okay, I'm kind of waiting on this. When are we going to see some more stuff? That's not to say that the Oregon staff isn't recruiting the heck out of, the country, but I feel like maybe a win like this could kind of catapult that a little bit more. What are your thoughts?
I think the recruiting for Oregon football to this point, and probably because this staff took over mid-cycle, it went in reverse order. Normally, you get a quarterback like a Dante Moore if you're a school that can go after that caliber of prospect, and you then pitch other recruits, right? And say, this is a guy you can be playing with. This is a guy that, is going to be the next leader of our football program, as Dan Lanning is probably telling future
Program podcast.
yeah, big time program podcast, mine as well. So I think what you're seeing is the potential of the staff is really, really high, because they're able to get an Ashton Cozart, a Jurion Dickey, a Dante Dowdell, a Josh Connerly, right? All of these guys they were able to get before Dante Moore. And I don't remember the exact date of everything, but a lot of them, I mean, Jurion Dickey's been committed to Oregon for a while now, right? And we didn't see a flood, mostly because the guys that Oregon have been targeting that are committed, for the most part, already were. Like Dante Moore is one of the later commits in the cycle, especially for a quarterback. He was on the board for a while. Not recruitment. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Max. It went well into the summer. And there was a lot of recruiting. There were a lot of commitments that were picked up in the springtime. And that's pretty natural because school's still in session. So you can have guys on campus for visits and whatnot. And getting Dante Moore is certainly huge. But I mean, I'm really excited looking and thinking about it in that context of what this staff can do in a full recruiting cycle, because I didn't think it would be this high for 2023 even. At this point, they're sitting 12th nationally. That's all you need for Oregon to accomplish its goals. You recruit a top 15 level year in and year out. If you have the right coaching, you'll have sufficient talent to get to the college football playoff and win conference championships. So I think it's just a testament to what this staff can do out on the recruiting trail, making pitches to high school kids and getting them to come to the Ducks without having to always have a big time quarterback there to kind of be the anchor recruit who helps those guys decide to come to Oregon. I think it's a reflection of where Oregon's brand is at nationally, and also what this staff can do on the recruiting front.
Yeah, and this cycle is so crucial for Oregon, Spencer, because it is the first full cycle for Dan Lanning and his newly assembled coaching staff. And got to give them some props for how they were able to close the 2022 cycle, when it just felt like guys were leaving left and right. I couldn't write decommitment stories fast enough when Mario Cristobal left, but now it's a different story with the talent that they're bringing in, and they're still pursuing a lot of really high-end guys in 2023. But one note that I just wanted to get on the show here before we get out of here, some significant recruiting news just today. Long Beach Poly 2024 linebacker Dylan Williams announced that he would be decommitting from USC. I'm actually supposed to go to Long Beach Poly in just a couple hours here, try to get an interview with Dylan. Great kid, talked to him a couple times, but it's interesting because he just got an offer from Oregon a week ago today. And then now you have this news dropping. So, Oregon's also recruiting Dalen Austin, the 2023 LSU cornerback that is at Long Beach Poly right now. Dalen was in town for a visit for the Stanford game, actually, and then he's working on setting up his official visit to Oregon. So I just wanted to hop on the show and make sure I got this update in there, just so you guys can see the latest news of kind of what we're tracking here. Oregon hasn't really done a whole lot in 2024 from a commitment standpoint, still looking for that first one, but they were really attacking the 2024 class during the bye week and even beyond with some 25 offers. So Dylan Williams is a dude, one of the best in Southern California for 2024. And I know that Oregon really likes him. So definitely someone that people need to keep an eye on if you like Oregon recruiting.
Yeah, I am always perplexed at how a staff can balance recruiting while in season, and it's why you have Marshall Malkow, I believe it is. Might be, I'm
Malco,
pretty
yeah.
sure. Yeah, Malco. Yeah, and he's the director of player personnel and recruiting for the Ducks, and why you have recruiting specialists and why you have a budget, because it's just a lot to manage, and you have to also. I don't know if you want your text messages
My
up
bad.
there for
Didn't need
everyone
to put
to
that up there.
see.
Sorry about that.
I think it's amazing how these staffs can, understand what they have in 2023, but also look at 2024. And it's fascinating to see where the priorities come in. I'm not surprised. In fact, I'm encouraged that this staff sees what I am seeing, which is in 2023, you need to be loading up on the defensive line, because you're going to lose guys after this year. It's already, I'm not going to say a full-on weakness, because Dorless and DJ Johnson have been really good, but it feels kind of thin, right? Like if Dorless or DJ Johnson goes down, I don't feel confident in Oregon's pass rush anymore. I need both of them out there on the field. Casey Rogers, Jordan Riley do some nice things for sure, but even they are out of eligibility after this year. Rogers might have one more. I'd have to look that up.
Just last season right now.
Riley, I know, is done after this year. So you're losing three of your heavy rotation guys after this season. And also, philosophically, if you're a defensive coach in Dan Lanning, how do you dominate defensively? You got to be great up front. You have to be great up front. Being able to get pressure with 4 opens up a lot of avenues for your defense. And so I'm not surprised to see guys like Amari Washington and Terrence Green and Tavita Pomee and, just go down the list of, Blake Purchase on the edge, Tatum Tuioti as well, who I think has been getting a little bit of buzz. He's just a 3-star prospect right now, but kind of seems like in the coming months he could up that status. We'll have to just wait and see and such, but I've heard good things about him. But I'm not surprised, Jaden Moore, another edge player, that they're focusing on that area, because they're saying, yeah, we need to be better here. And this is also a key part of what we do as a football team and what we want to do defensively. So I look at a guy like Williams and say, it's always nice to get talent. I'm not as worried about linebackers for the coming years, because I'm very high on Devin Jackson. I've heard a lot of great things about him, and he's not playing a ton really at all at this point in time, but I don't think anyone expected him to, because you got Noah Sewell and Justin Flo. But let's say those two guys leave. Well, I've watched Keith Brown play, and he's pretty good. He's not very fast, but he's pretty good. And Jackson's a speedster, so they can kind of be a yin and yang if they work in there. Jeffrey Bossa will be back for another season. You got Harrison Taggart in the mix, waiting in the wings. Like, there are a lot of bodies at that position I feel really good about, but it's honestly hard for me to think about 2024 recruiting when we're in the midst of the 2022 football season. It's like I want to get more talented guys than fewer talented guys, but at the same time, there's still a long way to go there. But it is always noteworthy to point out, like, hey, this guy's not going there, and he's someone who Oregon has been after and would certainly like to get.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, that's if it's hard to look ahead to the 2024 class, that's why I'm here, because I eat it up, man. I love the recruiting stuff. So that's I'm really trying to like actively do more recruiting on my site and on the podcast. So if that's something you guys like, you definitely need to make sure you're tapped in. But I think that's going to do it for us today.
Let's answer Gerard's question real quick, and then we can hop out.
Okay, all right. We'll get Gerard's question. I feel like this is a whole different show, but he said Gerard asks big picture question for the remaining 6 games. Rank the games in order from most likely and Oregon lost to the least likely for Oregon to win. Did I read that right? I think it might have been a little bit of a.
He's saying, like, what's the most likely game we win, and what's the least likely game that we win going forward. So I'm with him that Colorado is the easiest win, followed by Cal. I would say Oregon State is actually going to be an easier win than Washington, even though it's on the road. Now,
sure, I
could foresee the Ducks getting upset in either game. It wouldn't completely catch me off guard the way a Cal or Colorado loss would. But I think matchup-wise, because Oregon has shown that if you can't stop them on the ground, Arizona and Stanford, they'll just keep running it at you, then it makes the matchup a little bit better for Oregon State, I think, because the strength of that team is their secondary. And though they've done a lot of really good things, and they played well against USC, that's got the best receiving core in the Pac-12 for sure, I think Oregon can really run the football there. And I just feel better about running against the bodies that Oregon State has in the front seven versus Washington. I would swap those two. And I agree that Utah is the game that we're least likely to win. I have not sold my Ute stock on Locked On Pac-12, even after the Florida loss, even after the UCLA loss. I still rode with them and said, no, I think they win that game against USC. It was a little closer than I thought, but I didn't think it would be a blowout. They got it done. I think that's going to do wonders for their locker room. And that is still a really, really good football team. And though I love what I've seen from Oregon, I still think at this point in time, we'll see how I feel going into the game, but I still think UCLA or Utah rather is going to come into Autzen Stadium and beat Oregon. I still think that's a good football team. They're not quite as good as a year ago, but the gap that existed between those two teams in 2021 was pretty stark. Now, part of that was certainly coaching, and I think Oregon's improved in that front. However, I am a Utes believer at this point in time.
Sure. Yeah, I think that I would also swap Washington and Oregon State here. I think Washington's going to be a tougher game than Oregon State for me. And then with UCLA and Utah, I think I'd keep this order. Although my whole stance on Utah was they're going to be the top dog in the Pac-12 until another Pac-12 team knocks them off and is able to beat them, and that's what UCLA did. But there is, like I kind of talked about, some familiarity there with Oregon and UCLA from a year ago, just from a continuity perspective. But for Utah, I think this not only is the game at home this year, but this staff can make adjustments. That's clearly something that the last staff did not do to the level they needed to. I don't want to just flat out say they couldn't make adjustments, but that's kind of what it looked like. I'm sure a lot of fans would say that's kind of what it looked like when you have two mirror images of each other just 2 weeks apart, both of those being away from Eugene. That was part of the reason that, some of these Oregon games were toss-ups or they were closer than they needed to be. Look at Cal in 2020. Like, Oregon lost to Cal in 2020, and that game was in Berkeley.
There's no reason to ever lose to Cal.
Exactly. And I think I'm going to try to be at that game, get out and do some traveling. But we could talk about the Cal game later. So I feel like this list is pretty spot on, and we kind of are in agreement of swapping Washington, Oregon State.
And when one more thought on why I would swap the Beavs and the Huskies. I trust Washington's pass game way more, and their receivers scare me way more than Oregon State's. Penix and his receivers have been sharper from start to finish this year, even than Chance Nolan when he's been there with his wide receivers. Like, they're much more balanced. Washington doesn't run the ball very well, but Oregon defends the run very well. So I think DeBoer will go into that game and say, hey, Michael Penix, we're going to probably just throw the ball 50 times and see if Oregon can make some adjustments. And I think that's more of a test than an Oregon State offense that, we'll see if Chance Nolan is even healthy at that point in time. Certainly if Branson's there, who's like, okay, he's a serviceable backup. He's won a couple of games to be sure, but is he lighting the world on fire? No. Whereas Penix could go for 300 against this Oregon defense, I don't think either Nolan or Branson really could, because I don't think that's the way that Jonathan Smith primarily wants to play, but it's how you have to attack that Oregon State or that Oregon defense.
All right. Well, good question there from Gerard. Before we get out of here, Spencer, I think I'm hopping on your show tomorrow.
Yes, indeed.
Right? And then
it'll be Friday. I'm still planning out the shows because I had a guest who was coming on and he had to reschedule / cancel. So still figuring all that stuff out. But yes, Max will be on my show on either Thursday or Friday's episode of Locked On Ducks.
All right. And then where can people find, more of you and kind of what you got going on in the college football space?
At Smalls_55, my personal handle. I also manage at LO_Pac12 and at Locked On Ducks. I host Locked On Pac12 and Locked On Ducks Monday through Friday, wherever you get your podcasts, and on YouTube, talking about the Ducks every day and the Conference of Champions writ large. A lot of fun for both. Feel free to send in any questions you'd like 2smalls_55. If you want a question answered on the show. And Max, my man, it is always a pleasure to come on and talk to the great people over here in the Ducks Dish space.
I appreciate you coming on, taking the time out of your day to talk some Ducks with me and the lovely folks in the chat. I want to do like some more like mailbag oriented stuff. I put out tweets asking for mailbag questions and I don't always get a lot. But maybe we can do something like what Ryan does, like where we like put the StreamYard link in the chat, and then we can kind of get some people literally just on the channel having some awesome discourse about the Ducks. So let me know if you guys would be interested in something like that. Might want to test that out. But if you want to find more of me, you can hit me on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter at mtorresports. We're here on YouTube, Oregon Football Max Torres. Do me a quick favor, smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, and share the Ducks Dish podcast. That's the greatest way you can support the show. I'm looking to get Sam Connon, the UCLA publisher for Fan Nation, on for an episode this week. And we'll see what the rest of the schedule is looking like. But that'll do it for us here on the Ducks Dish podcast. We're going to go ahead and get out of here. But big week for the Ducks as they get ready to face UCLA. And we'll catch you guys in the next episode of the Ducks Dish podcast.